Brian was the first human ever at the Universal Acceptance Learning Facility. The school was an amalgamation of many races from all stretches of the galaxy, joined together in a culture of learning, acceptance, and the promotion of brotherhood. Or at least that's what the brochure said. Brian found it more like a giant jail cell, where each race stuck to their own and mistrusted, misunderstood, and mistreated each other. Being the only human in the entire facility, he had nowhere to turn for protection or friendship. He was truly alone in a hostile sea of aliens. There were a few he met that were not openly hostile to him, and he appreciated those moments, as few and far between as they were, but for the most part, he was either ostracized or downright bullied. The worst by far were the 3 reptilians that called their little group the Crive, which loosely translated meant the strong. They never missed a chance to harass Brian, often going out of their way to make his life a living hell. The very first day of school, they surrounded Brian after his first class. All 3 of them stood taller than Brian, but not by much.
"I thought humans were supposed to be big and strong,"
one hissed.
"You look like a clumsy, weak oaf."
Brian just remained silent.
"I could rip you apart right now if I felt like it,"
another hissed.
"You look like you could barely stand. You're all twitchy."
Again, Brian remained silent. The reptilians hissed and laughed and walked away, but they were right. Brian was not very coordinated, and his limbs did seem to twitch when he moved, almost like his body was fighting itself. With a sad sigh, he went to his next class. He could not help how his body moved. It was just a cross he had to bear. As the weeks went on, the teasing got worse. The Crive tripped him in the halls, knocked his datapad out of his hands, and laughed as he struggled to pick it up off the floor. His muscles not reacting the way they should, making every movement an ordeal. It became more and more physical. With each incident, the Crive would throw in his face how the humans had a reputation as fighters and being tough, when in reality they were weak, awkward, and soft. It got to the point that Brian tried to avoid the Crive, ducking into empty classrooms, leaving class early, anything he could think of in an effort to avoid them. It all came to a head one day, when, as Brian was walking to a class, the 3 Crive members jumped out, grabbed him, and pulled him into an empty room.
"We're going to teach you to respect your betters,"
one of them hissed, laughing. It drew back and smashed Brian in the mouth with a closed fist, sending him crashing awkwardly to the floor. As he lay there, feeling the blood trickle from his mouth, Brian snapped. He reached out and grabbed the clawed foot of his attacker and pulled. With a surprised yelp, the reptilian crashed to the floor, where Brian pounced on it, punching him in the face. The other 2 Crive dragged Brian off their friend, punching him as they did so. Brian fought back, but there were too many of them, and they were too strong. Soon, Brian was lying on the floor, face covered in blood, clutching his side, where he had been kicked repeatedly. His attackers, however, all sported puffed faces and trickled green blood from the wounds Brian had inflicted. If there had only been one of them, the Crive knew that Brian would probably have won.
"I guess you humans are pretty tough,"
one of them said, gingerly touching his eye, which was swollen and discolored.
"But not as tough as the Crive."
And with that, the reptilian drove a vicious kick into Brian's chest. Brian coughed, sending flecks of blood out onto the floor, and then he started to laugh. A slow chuckle at first, but soon he was laughing, even wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. The Crive were looking at Brian questioningly.
"I guess they're insane as well,"
one said.
"I think we broke him,"
another added. Brian just slowly shook his head. No, nothing like that," he said through his laughter. "It's just that I know something you don't."
"And what is that?"
one of the attackers hissed menacingly. Brian looked up at them. "It's just that I'm wearing a PID." The Crive looked at each other. None of them have heard of a PID.
"What is that?"
one asked. "You see," Brian said as he struggled to his feet, For me to be allowed to attend this school, I had to agree to wear a PID. Otherwise, I might have hurt someone without meaning to. The Crive tensed. They did not know what was going on. A PID is a personal inertia dampener. It restricts my movement and turns my own strength against me, making me struggle to do the simplest things. I laughed because, while saying this, Brian reached for his belt and turned a small knob until it clicked. I can turn it off. Raising himself to his full height for the first time, towering over the Crive and stretching his muscles in a fluid, languid motion and wiping the back of his hand across his bleeding mouth, he smiled at his attackers. They looked at Brian in shock and alarm. Gone was the awkward human they bullied. In front of them was a towering, imposing figure. Now, he said, glaring at them, where were we?